How the National Party stole down the country bill.
I call the honourable member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm very happy to take a call in the final stages of this debate on the Mixed Ownership Model Bill on Supplementary Order Paper number 41, which will divide the bill into two bills, the new bills being the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act of 2012 and the Public Finance (Mixed Ownership Model) Amendment Act of 2012. Now, I want to ask the Minister one or two questions on how this SOP has been structured and the reasons for doing so. This bill, part one of the bill, which is going to become the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act, actually amends more than just the State-Owned Enterprises Act. It also contains amendments to the Ombudsman's Act, the amendments to the Official Information Act, amendments to the Public Finance Act, amendments to the Income Tax Act. And I am wondering why it is that in moving this SOP to divide the bill, it's actually only been divided into two bills, and it hasn't been divided into bills for all of the respective legislation that it amends, because actually the amendments are more than just, in part one, are more than just to the State-Owned Enterprises Act. For example, amendments to the Ombudsman's Act repeal a number of provisions from the Ombudsman's Act, and surely that is a reason that that should have been separated out into a separate amendment, or a separate bill, or separate act, sorry. We're getting to the point where it was about to become an act. It should be separated out into a separate Ombudsman's Amendment Act, and it should have been separated into a separate Amendment Act for the Official Information Act, a separate Amendment Act for the Public Finance Act, and a separate Amendment Act for the Income Tax Act. So I'd quite like to know, I guess as much from an interest in parliamentary proceedings as anything else, why it is that it hasn't actually been separated into all of the respective acts. It's a relatively simple question, but it seems a bit odd that we would go so far as to separate it into two, but not go so far as to separate it into about seven, because I think in total there's about 7 acts that are amended by this SOP. So that's the first question that I have for the Minister. The second question that I have really for the House is whether the titles that are being used for the two bills or the two acts that this bill will become accurately describe the contents of the bill that we're debating. And I think that's very important from a legislative perspective. We have a convention in New Zealand that our legislation, the titles of our legislation, are not overly political, that they're factual, that they describe what the subject matter is. If you go look at other jurisdictions overseas, they have laws that are very politically labelled, that don't necessarily describe No Child Left Behind Act, for example, the Clean Skies Act, that don't really describe the contents of the legislation in question. We don't have that convention here, or that practice here in New Zealand. Our convention is that our titles tend to be pretty boring, and they just tend to be relatively factual descriptions of the laws concerned. So the question the House now turns its attention to is whether the two new acts being proposed here, or the titles for the two new acts being proposed here, accurately describe, in accordance with those conventions for how we label the acts, the content of them. So the State-Owned Enterprises Amendment Act 2012, I think, is probably a reasonably accurate description for that part, although having said that, again, it comes back to my question about whether it accurately describes the contents of the Act, given that it amends a whole lot of other acts in addition to the State-Owned Enterprises Act. But when we come to the second part, which is our amendments to the Public Finance Act, an act that is going to be subject to further amendment by this House, I would say in the fairly near future, is the use of the term Public Finance (Mixed Ownership Model) Amendment Act an accurate description for what this bill actually does? And I think that's where we want to spend a little bit of time pulling that apart, because a mixed ownership model is frankly, it's a legal fiction. There is no such thing as a mixed ownership model. Effectively, what the substance of the bill does is it removes these entities from the state, what's it called, the State-Owned Enterprises Act, where there's a legal nature of them, a very detailed legal kind of purpose and so on for them, and it puts them into this ether, where they're kind of not quite private companies, but they're not quite state-owned enterprises or public companies anymore either. And this is a whole new thing, because actually it's a fiction to say that it's mixed ownership model, because it's portraying it as something that it's not. The government will no longer be the owner of these companies, it will merely be a shareholder in them. Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. So the substance of the issue is whether the title Public Finance Mixed Ownership Model Amendment Act is an accurate description of what's being done here, because as I said, there really is no such thing as a mixed ownership model. This is a legal fiction that's being created by the government, because it probably would be more accurate to say public finance share sales in previously public assets Amendment Act, because that's effectively what it's doing. These will now become publicly listed companies, and the fact that the government owns the majority of shares in the publicly listed company doesn't get away from the fact that they are going to be publicly listed companies. So they're no longer going to be state-owned enterprises. They're no longer going to be publicly owned assets. Although the government may own 51% of them, that doesn't make them a publicly owned asset anymore. So the question that I have is whether the description that's being used here, Public Finance Mixed Ownership Model Bill, Mixed Ownership Model Amendment Act, is an accurate description, and I don't think it is, because as I've pointed out, there isn't really any such thing as a mixed ownership model. So then the question becomes, well, does this new act that's being created adequately establish a robust, legitimate framework for there to be such a thing as a mixed ownership model? It's a very light piece of legislation, and I don't think it does. Because the title of this Act suggests that it's creating a whole new framework, something that's entirely new, in the nature that the State-Owned Enterprises Act would have been back when it was first created in, I think it was 1986, was it 86?
For the SOE Act.
For the SOE Act, it was 86. So when that was first established, it was quite a substantial act. I was at primary school, actually, Ms Dyson. It was a substantial act, and it created, Morris was here, and it created a significant new body of law and a significant new structure for companies. And what this Act does, so the question we have, and asking whether this is an appropriate name for what will become a part of the Public Finance Act, the question that we have to ask ourselves is mixed ownership model a sufficient description for that? Because it is nowhere near as substantial as the State-Owned Enterprises Act actually was. And of course it hasn't been through quite the same process that the State-Owned Enterprises Act went through when it was first established. So I would argue quite strongly that, in fact, this isn't an accurate description of the law that's being created by this Parliament, that it's a term of spin that's being used in the title of an Act, which is not something that this Parliament has traditionally engaged in doing. And therefore, I think we should find a more accurate description for the title. But on the wider issue, I still have the question as to why this bill isn't being divided into many, many more contributing acts or amendment acts for all of the relevant pieces of legislation, for the relevant pieces of legislation that it amends, because, as I've said, it covers the Ombudsman's Act and the Official Information Act, and the Public Finance Act, all of which I regard as constitutional instruments in New Zealand's law. The Income Tax Act, which is amended all of the time, and so while it has a significant bearing on Parliament's income, I wouldn't necessarily describe it quite so much in the constitutional sense, although I'm probably going to get emails about that. But certainly the Ombudsman's Act, the Official Information Act and the Public Finance Act, all parts of our constitutional framework. We don't have a written constitution in New Zealand, so when we're amending them, I think we should be explicit about the fact that we are amending them, and I don't think that this piece of legislation does that. So at this point, Mr Chair, I think that probably concludes my remarks on this comment, but I do look forward to the contribution of the Minister. I see that he's been taking some notes, and I'm sure that he's going to clarify my concerns.
Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Louise Upston.